Well, what that means is that it's not immediately clear to the reader where each of the three items begins and ends. So the author of this sentence has wisely chosen to use semicolons to separate the items. That makes it clear that there are three items being listed here, even though there are commas within each of the items. So it's correctly punctuated this way. Thomas Jefferson, comma, a planter from Virginia, semicolon. That warns you that another item is about to begin. Alexander Hamilton, comma, an aide to Washington during the Revolution, semicolon. And James Madison, comma, a legislator from Massachusetts. So here's another useful place to insert semicolons when you're writing a list that contains lengthy items which themselves contain commas. In order to make it clearer where the items begin and end, separate them using semicolons. In this case, notice that the semicolons do not separate independent clauses. These are not groups of words that could stand alone as sentences. Most of the time, semicolons are used only for that purpose. But here is an exception which occasionally comes up and which you need to be aware of. Now let's turn to colons. Use a colon to indicate that what follows is equivalent to what precedes the colon. In other words, a colon is used to introduce a group of words that restate or say in other words what you just said before the colon. What appears on either side of the colon, then, should be more or less equivalent or equal in meaning. Here's a tip for you. When used correctly, the colon can often be replaced with the words that is, or in other words. So you can test your use of a colon by asking yourself that question. Could I take away the colon and substitute the words that is, or in other words? If so, you are probably using the colon correctly. You don't use the colon, notice, to separate independent clauses. That's a job for the semicolon. Instead, the colon is introducing something which simply restates or says, in other words, what you just said. Here are a couple of examples. The silent movie era produced three comic geniuses: Charles Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. This is a good example of the correct use of a colon. We put the colon after the word geniuses, introducing that list of Charles Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. Notice that what appears on either side of the colon is more or less equivalent. We just mentioned three comic geniuses. Who were they? Charles Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. Those three names are equivalent to or equal to what was stated just before the colon, three comic geniuses. Let's try our tip, our test for using a colon correctly. Could we take away the colon and replace it with the words that is, or in other words? We could. The silent movie era produced three comic geniuses, that is, Charles Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. The sentence reads better with a colon, but it does make sense to substitute the words that is for the colon. So that's a signal that we're using the colon correctly. One more example. I drove all night for only one purpose, to ask Annalisa to marry me. Once again, the colon is separating two things that are more or less equivalent in meaning. One purpose. What was that one purpose? To ask Annalisa to marry me. Those two things are the same. The purpose was the asking. The two things are equivalent. If we took out the colon and substituted the words that is, would it make sense? It would. I drove all night for only one purpose, that is, to ask Annalisa to marry me. So once again, we can see that we're using the colon correctly. Remember that the semicolon separates independent clauses. That's not the case with the colon. Instead, the test for using a colon correctly is whether the things on either side are basically equivalent or the same in meaning. If so, then a colon is correct. One last tip. Don't use a colon to separate words that clearly belong together, such as a verb and its object, or a preposition and its object. People know that a colon is used to introduce things, and so sometimes they get carried away and use colons where they actually interrupt the flow of the sentence and aren't really needed. Here are a couple of examples of incorrect uses of the colon, which you ought to avoid. Leanna gave her mother, colon, a scarf from Mexico. Here, the writer knows that a colon can be used sometimes to introduce something which is going to be described, and so he or she has put a colon after the word mother. But if you look closely, you see that the colon is really separating things that belong together. It's separating the verb gave from its direct object, scarf. The scarf is what Leanna gave. So it really makes sense for the sentence to simply flow rather than putting the colon in. And the colon, in any case, could not be removed and substituted for the words "that is." And what appears on either side of the colon is not equivalent. The mother and the scarf from Mexico are not equivalent. So for all those reasons, inserting a colon in this sentence is incorrect. And one more example. The new security plan was developed by, the local police commissioner and the State Department of Safety. Once again, the colon has been used here as a kind of an introductory punctuation mark. And we've seen that colons can be used to introduce lists, as, for example, in the sentence we looked at previously, where the colon introduced the list Charles Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. So the person who wrote this sentence is thinking, well, I have a kind of a list here, the local police commissioner and the State Department of Safety. So why not put a colon in front of it? Well, the reason is that the colon, in this case, is separating the preposition by from the object of the preposition. The plan was developed by whom? By the police commissioner, State Department of Safety. So the objects of the preposition come right after the colon. The colon, therefore, interrupts or breaks the flow of the preposition and its objects. And once again, what follows and precedes the colon are not equivalent. The new security plan was developed by is not equivalent to police commissioner, Department of Safety. So for all those reasons, the use of a colon in this instance is wrong. So remember our basic rule, the colon should introduce things that are equivalent to what precedes the colon, and you should be able to substitute the words "that is" for the colon and have the sentence still make basically the same sense and the same meaning. If that's not the case, then you're using the colon inappropriately. Okay, those are the basic rules for using the semicolon and the colon correctly. Try your hand at the exercise and see whether you've mastered those rules. When you're done, come back and we'll take a look at those questions together. Now, in some of these sentences, colons or semicolons may appear, and when they appear, they may or may not be used correctly. In other instances, semicolons or colons ought to be inserted. So your job is to read each sentence and figure out what ought to be done about semicolons and colons. Let's look at the first example. To this day, millions of opera lovers consider one man the greatest singer of all time, Enrico Caruso, the renowned Italian tenor. Now, there are no semicolons or colons in this sentence. Do you think either one should be inserted somewhere? What about a semicolon? Remember that a semicolon would normally be used when you have two or more independent clauses joined without a coordinating conjunction. Could this sentence be broken down into two parts that could each stand alone as a sentence? No, not really. There's only one clause here. Opera lovers consider is the subject and the verb, and there's really only one independent clause, and therefore a semicolon wouldn't really be appropriate. But there is a place where a colon ought to be used, and that would be after the expression, the greatest singer of all time, colon, because what follows is equivalent to or a restatement of what comes before. The greatest singer of all time is who? Enrico Caruso, the renowned Italian tenor. So what comes before and after the punctuation mark there is basically equivalent in meaning. So a colon would be the appropriate punctuation mark to use. Notice that we could also use the words "that is" instead, and the sentence would mean very much the same thing. That's a good test as to whether a colon is appropriate or not. So to correct this sentence, after the word time, use a colon rather than a comma. Next example. If you see a parking spot on the street, put your car there. Otherwise, use a parking lot. Now, this sentence, again, doesn't contain any semicolon or colon. Does it need one? The answer is yes. In fact, as written, the sentence is actually an error. It's a run-on sentence. Let's break it down and see how that works. The sentence begins with a dependent clause or a subordinate clause, a clause that cannot stand alone as a sentence. If you see a parking spot on the street, it has the subject you, the verb see, and it begins with the subordinating conjunction if, which means that it can't stand alone as a sentence. What follows then is an independent clause, one that could stand alone as a sentence. Put your car there. Here the verb is put, the unspoken subject is you. It's telling you to do something, and it could stand alone as a sentence. Put your car there. And what follows is yet another independent clause, which could also stand alone as a sentence. Otherwise, use a parking lot. So we have a subordinate clause followed by two independent clauses, which are simply joined together without a coordinating conjunction or a semicolon. To be correct, we need a semicolon separating the two independent clauses. So the sentence would then read, if you see a parking spot on the street, comma, put your car there, semicolon. Otherwise, comma, use a parking lot. The semicolon is needed to separate the two independent clauses which are being joined together without a coordinating conjunction. What appears on either side of the semicolon should be able to stand alone as a sentence. And when you read the sentence that way, you can see that that in fact is the case. So insert the semicolon after the word there, and the sentence is now correct. Next example. Under relentless questioning by the teacher, Joanne finally admitted that, colon, she had copied part of her paper from a book in the school library. Now, is the colon being correctly used here? We've seen that colons often do introduce things, but what the colon should introduce is a restatement of what immediately precedes. In this case, what follows the colon is, she had copied part of her paper from a book in the school library. Is there anything that comes before the colon that's equivalent to that or means basically the same thing? Not really. So in this case, the colon is really separating things that belong together. It's not introducing a restatement. And if you apply the test of could it be deleted and replaced with the words that is, or in other words, you can see the sentence wouldn't really make sense. Joanne finally admitted that, that is, she had copied part of her paper. No, that really doesn't sound right. So in this case, the colon is wrong and should actually simply be deleted so that the flow of the sentence would not be interrupted. Joanne finally admitted that she had copied part of her paper. Now the sentence connects the things that logically belong together, and the unnecessary colon no longer interrupts the flow of the sentence. Next example. At first, Columbus thought his ships had landed in India, semicolon. For this reason, he called the native people he encountered Indians. Now, is this semicolon correct? Remember that a semicolon is normally used to separate two independent clauses. Are these independent clauses, each of which could stand alone as a sentence? Let's read them and see. At first, Columbus thought his ships had landed in India. Does that sound as though it could stand alone as a sentence? Indeed, it does. It has a subject and a verb. It's independent in meaning and could stand alone as a sentence. What about what follows the semicolon? For this reason, he called the native people he encountered Indians. This, too, could stand alone as a sentence. It's also an independent clause. So we have two independent clauses that have been stuck together. You need a semicolon between them to separate them. So in this case, the sentence needs no correction. It's perfectly right as originally written. The semicolon is correct and necessary. One more sentence. 4 cities are being considered to host the World Soccer Championships, semicolon. Madrid, Spain, Seoul, South Korea, Sydney, Australia, and Bogota, Colombia. Okay, the sentence is a little hard to read, isn't it? That should tell you right off the bat that there's something wrong with the punctuation. And actually, there are a couple of problems. First of all, let's look at the semicolon that appears after the word championships. Is that a correct use of the semicolon? Again, normally what appears on either side of the semicolon should be able to stand alone as a sentence. Let's check that out. What comes before the semicolon is 4 cities are being considered to host the World Soccer Championships. That could stand alone as a sentence, so that's fine. What follows the semicolon, however, is Madrid, Spain, Seoul, South Korea, Sydney, Australia, and Bogota, Colombia. Could that stand alone as a sentence? No, it's clearly just a list. So the semicolon is being incorrectly used here. What should be used instead of the semicolon? Well, here's a place where a colon could be used. We've seen that colons can be used to introduce lists, and what follows the colon is indeed a restatement of what comes before. What comes before the colon is the reference to 4 cities are being considered to host the World Soccer Championships. And what follows is a list of those 4 cities. You could indeed put in the words that is, or in other words, in place of a colon in that spot. So a colon should come after the word championships, not a semicolon. So that's the first change we need to make. Now, what about the list of cities themselves? You might have found this very confusing. It says that we're talking about 4 cities, but we've got a whole bunch of proper names here separated just by commas. Madrid, comma, Spain, comma, Seoul, comma, South Korea, comma, Sydney, comma, and so on. Now, if you didn't know anything about these names, you might think, well, what's going on here? It sounds like there are maybe 8 names being listed here, but there's supposed to be 4 cities. Madrid, Spain, Seoul, South Korea, Sydney. What's going on here? Well, if you know even a little bit about geography, you'll know that these are 4 cities that are being listed, in each case with the country where they're located. And you would normally list a city and a country with a comma in between them. So it's proper to describe the city of Madrid, Spain as being Madrid, comma, Spain. That's the city of Madrid in the country of Spain. So here we have 4 items in a list, each item containing a comma unto itself. So we have Madrid, comma, Spain, Seoul, comma, South Korea, Sydney, comma, Australia, and Bogota, comma, Colombia. Now, what do we do when we have items in a list, each of which contains a comma? For clarity's sake, this is the other instance where we would use a semicolon. We can separate the items in the list with semicolons just because the items themselves contain commas. And it's confusing if you only use commas. You can't tell then where one item begins and the next item ends. So the proper way to punctuate this list would be to use semicolons between the items. And that way it's easy to tell where each item starts. And the list would then read Madrid, comma, Spain, semicolon, Seoul, comma, South Korea, semicolon, Sydney, comma, Australia, semicolon, and Bogota, comma, Colombia. Now the list is clear, easy to understand, and we can tell where each of the 4 city names begins and ends. That's the other use of the semicolon, the exception to the rule that normally semicolons should only be used to separate independent clauses. Sometimes when you're writing something, you want to quote what someone else has said. This might happen, for example, in a short story or a diary where you're writing about an incident from life, either imagined or real, and you have characters who exchange dialogue, who talk to one another. It might also happen in an essay that you might be writing for a class at school where you want to quote what some other writer has said, or perhaps quote from a figure from history. In all of these cases, you need to use quotation marks to show where the words you are quoting begin and end. Here's the basic rule. Use quotation marks to set off the words in a direct quotation. Since the quotation marks have to indicate where the quoted words begin and end, quotation marks are always used in pairs, and they're sometimes referred to as opening and closing quotation marks, beginning and ending quotation marks. Any expression like that is equally clear and equally correct. The important thing to realize is that you always need both of the pairs of quotation marks. You need quotation mark at the beginning of the quotation and at the end, so it's very clear to the reader where the quotation begins and ends. Here's a simple example. "I have a dream," said Martin Luther King, Jr. The words that Martin Luther King, Jr. actually said were, "I have a dream." So to indicate which words those were, we put the opening quotation marks before I and the closing quotation marks after dream. You'll notice that we also have inserted a comma after the word dream, preceding the quotation marks. In a moment, we're going to look closely at the rules about that, but as a general practice, quotations are usually set off from the rest of the sentence with commas. There's no hard and fast rule about that, but that's what most writers do, and it's a safe rule for you to follow. The important thing at this point to remember is that the exact words of the quotation must be set off by a pair of quotation marks at the beginning and end of the quotation. Now, how exactly do you combine quotation marks with other punctuation marks? It can be a bit tricky. Here's the rule. Put periods and commas inside the closing quotation marks. Put other punctuation marks outside unless they themselves are part of the quotation. Before we go further, I should explain that the practice of putting periods and commas inside the closing quotation marks is what's done in the United States. In England and other countries where British practice is followed, the periods and commas often appear outside the closing quotation marks. But if you are writing and working in the United States, it's safe to put periods and commas inside the closing quotation marks, as we did a moment ago with our quotation from the famous speech of Martin Luther King, Jr. Notice that, however, other punctuation marks should be put outside the closing quotation marks unless they themselves are part of the quotation. This would apply, for example, to colons, semicolons, exclamation points, and question marks. And another rule to remember is don't double up on punctuation marks. That is, in and around quotations, you don't need or want to put both a period and a question mark, for example, which you might be tempted to do if there's a question mark within the quotation. Let's take a look at some examples that will help you sort out what could be a confusing set of rules. The first example reads as follows. Paula said, "I'll be back by dinner time." Notice the punctuation that we've used in this sentence. The words that Paula actually said were, "I'll be back by dinner time." So we have quotation marks around those words. We have the opening quotation mark before "I'll" and the closing one after "time." Fine. Now we also have a comma and a period. As we indicated a moment ago, you usually will set off the quotation with a comma from the rest of the sentence. So we have a comma after the word said. Paula said, comma, "I'll be back by dinner time," so that the words that Paula said are being separated from the rest of the sentence by a comma. Finally, since the sentence ends, we need some kind of end punctuation mark, and a period seems to be appropriate. So we have a period at the end of the sentence as well, and following the U.S. rule, we put the period inside the quotation mark. So the sentence is correctly punctuated. Paula said, comma, "I'll be back by dinner time," period, with the quotation marks around "I'll be back by dinner time." Now let's look at this next sentence for a slightly different problem. Then she asked, "What are you planning to cook?" Okay, Paula's exact words in this sentence are, "What are you planning to cook?" So the quotation marks surround those words. The opening quotation marks come before "what," and the closing or ending quotation marks come after "cook." Again, we have a comma separating the quotation from the rest of the sentence. Then she asked, comma, "What are you planning to cook?" Now, we have to have a question mark here, don't we? Because there is a question in this sentence. What are you planning to cook is an interrogative sentence, and therefore it needs a question. Now, where should that question mark go? Should it go before or after the closing quotation mark? Should it be part of the quotation or not? Well, if you think about what Paula is saying, her actual statement is itself the question. What are you planning to cook? She's asking a question, therefore the question mark belongs with the quotation. It's part of the quotation itself. So this sentence should be punctuated with the question mark inside the quotation marks, inside those closing marks. So the sentence correctly is punctuated. Then she asked, comma, opening quotation marks. What are you planning to cook? Question mark, closing quotation marks. So we've got the question mark inside the quotation marks because it's actually part of the quotation. It's what Paula actually said. Now for a third example, which has to be handled a little differently. Kevin answered, "I think I'll make beef stroganoff. At least that's what I think he said." Okay, here we have Kevin making a statement, and the author of this sentence goes on to make a separate statement, "At least that's what I think he said." So let's see how we should punctuate this. What are Kevin's actual words? "I think I'll make beef stroganoff." That's the actual quotation from Kevin. So the quotation marks should be around those words. The opening quotation marks will come before "I," and the closing quotation marks come after stroganoff. Once again, we have a comma separating the quotation from the rest of the sentence. Kevin answered, comma, and then the quotation appears. Now, after the quotation, we have a whole other clause. "At least that's what I think he said." That's not part of the quotation. The author of the sentence is saying that. And since we have two independent clauses here, what punctuation mark do we need to separate the two independent clauses? Well, as you know, you need a semicolon in that instance, because we have two independent clauses, each of which could stand alone as a sentence. One sentence could read, "Kevin answered, I think I'll make beef stroganoff." That could be a sentence by itself. You could also have a sentence that simply reads, At least that's what I think he said. That could be a sentence by itself. Since we have two independent clauses simply stuck together, we need a semicolon between them. But now the question is, where does the semicolon go in relation to the quotation marks? Well, remember our rule. Other punctuation marks, other than commas and periods, go outside of the closing quotation marks unless they're part of the quotation. Is the semicolon part of what Kevin said, I think I'll make beef stroganoff? Not really. Kevin just made that statement, and there's no semicolon within that. He's not connecting it to some other statement. So the semicolon is really grammatically necessary as part of the larger structure, not as part of the quotation itself. Unlike the example we saw before where the question mark was part of what Paula said. So in this case, the semicolon is not actually part of the quotation, and it should go outside of the quotation marks. So the sentence would be correctly punctuated. Kevin answered, comma, open quotation marks. I think I'll make beef stroganoff, closing quotation marks, semicolon. At least that's what I think he said. So the rules can get a little tricky as to where the punctuation marks go in relation to the quotation marks. The key thing to remember is comma and period you can always put inside the closing quotation marks. Other punctuation marks, it all depends on whether the punctuation mark is actually part of the quotation or not. If it is, it goes inside the quotation marks, otherwise outside. And with practice, you'll find that the rule is not that difficult to understand and practice. Just think about these particular rules each time you write a sentence with a quotation in it, and in time you'll become comfortable with the rule. Now, quotation marks are also used in a couple of other specific circumstances, the most important of which is governed by the following rule. Use quotation marks to set off the titles of essays, poems, articles, stories, and chapters in books. Normally, quotation marks are used for the titles of shorter works. Most other titles, for example, the titles of full-length books, are either underlined if you are handwriting or typing your work, or printed in italics, which is the case in a printed book or when you're typing on a computer. So generally speaking, as a rule, the titles of longer works, such as full-length books, are underlined or printed in italics, while the titles of shorter units, such as essays, poems, articles, and stories, would be contained within quotation marks. And there are other rules for other types of literary or other works, and you'll have to refer to a grammar handbook for more specialized instances. But generally speaking, the titles of shorter works would be contained within quotation marks. For example, my favorite short story is Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. Here the title of the story is The Lottery, so the quotation marks appear around those words, The Lottery. And once again, the sentence ends with a period, which, like all periods, goes inside the quotation mark. Use single quotation marks to set off the words in a quotation within a quotation. Normally, again, in American practice, the quotation marks that we use are double quotation marks. That is, you see the two little curlicues that make up the quotation mark. However, there is such a thing as a single quotation mark, which is used for a very specific purpose. It doesn't come up that often, but occasionally it does come up. Once in a while, within a quotation, there is a quotation. That is, within the quoted words, the person who is saying those quoted words is himself quoting someone else. When that's the case, you need somehow to set off that inner quotation from the larger outer quotation. And it would be a bit confusing if you simply use the same kind of quotation marks, because after a while people would become confused. Is this the quote within the quote, or is it just the larger quote? Therefore, the practice that has evolved over time is to use double quotation marks for normal quotations, and in the unusual circumstance where there is a quotation within a quotation, to use single quotation marks to set that off. Here's an example of how that might look. King declared, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Okay, we're returning again to the famous speech on civil rights by the great African-American leader, Martin Luther King. And in that speech, Martin Luther King did himself quote other famous words. In this particular quotation, Martin Luther King was quoting from the Declaration of Independence. The words from the Declaration of Independence that Martin Luther King was quoting were, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." So this particular sentence is quoting Martin Luther King, who in turn was quoting another literary work. So here's how the quotation marks have to work. We put normal double quotation marks around all of King's words, starting with "I have a dream" and ending with the end of the sentence, that all men are created equal. Because all of that is what King said as he got up on the podium on that important historical day. All of that is what King said, so all of that is contained within the double quotation marks. But then within the quotation, where King was himself quoting the Declaration of Independence, we use the single quotation marks to set off those words and make it obvious to the reader where the quotation within the quotation begins and ends, which does mean that at the end of the sentence, the single and double quotation marks appear together. It's a little tricky, and you have to look closely to see what you're seeing, but that's the right way to do it. So the sentence is correctly punctuated this way: King declared, comma, opening double quotation marks, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, comma, opening single quotation marks. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, period, closing single quotation marks, closing double quotation marks." And that's the way the sentence should be constructed. Will this come up often in your writing? Not at all. But it will occasionally happen, and when you're reading, you'll see sentences written this way. So it's important to understand the rule, not only for your writing, but also so that when you're reading written works, you'll understand exactly how the quotation marks work. Finally, quotation marks are often misused. Don't use quotation marks for emphasis or to cast doubt. Here are a couple of examples of ways that you'll see quotation marks used, which are really not right. In one case, it's actually wrong, and in the other case, it's kind of a sloppy or lazy use of quotation marks. Our first example, which is strictly wrong, is sometimes you'll see signs in stores or other locations that read something like this: "Special today, quote, fresh corn on the cob." The author of this sentence is trying to emphasize the word fresh. He's trying to say, wow, it's really fresh. You really want this corn on the cob. But by putting the quotes around the word fresh, he's making it sound as though he is quoting some other source, that the word fresh comes from someone else, which doesn't really make sense. If the author of this sign wants to emphasize fresh, perhaps he could underline it or even print it in a different color. But quotation marks are really only used to mean these are words that I am borrowing from some other source. It doesn't really make sense to use them for emphasis, as people often carelessly do when they're writing things like signs. If you find them in your own papers, that's wrong. Correct that. And here's another example. If the English always seem grouchy, it's probably because of their country's, quote, beautiful weather. Sometimes people will use quotation marks this way in order to indicate a slightly different meaning, to say, well, I don't really believe that this is true. It's a way of casting doubt or making fun of what's being said. And sometimes, even in conversation, people will hold up their fingers and wiggle them to say, quote, as if to indicate that there's some doubt about what is being said. Like, oh yeah, that was a great concert. You see, it's a way of being sarcastic. But it's not a very clear or effective way of communicating the meaning. And so you should avoid using quotation marks in this way. It's a somewhat lazy way of trying to be sarcastic or ironic or cast some kind of doubt on what you're saying. In this case, it doesn't really work very well as a piece of writing, and the author would be better off simply straightforwardly saying what he's trying to say. If he's trying to say that English weather is always gloomy, drizzly, and chilly, he ought to say that rather than saying, quote, beautiful weather. The point would come across much more clearly that way. So avoid that careless and sloppy use of quotation marks. You do see it from time to time, but it's not really good writing. Okay, we have an exercise that will test your ability to use quotation marks correctly. Turn to your study guide, and when you finish the exercise, come back and we'll see how well you did. Now, in these sentences, quotation marks have been omitted, And we've also left out some of the punctuation marks that ought to be included, so you can have the fun of figuring out which punctuation marks belong here and where they ought to go in relation to the quotation marks. So let's go through each of these sentences and see how well you were able to figure that out. First, as Robert Frost remarked in his poem Mending Wall, good fences make good neighbors. Now, there are actually two things in this sentence that need to be enclosed within quotation marks. There's the quotation itself, the words that come from the poem. The quotation is, good fences make good neighbors. So we want to put double quotation marks, normal quotation marks, around that entire sentence. So we'd have opening quotation marks before good and closing quotation marks after neighbors. In addition, the title of the poem, Mending Wall, should also be contained within quotation marks. Remember that titles of poems are one of the kinds of titles that would normally be enclosed within quotation marks. So we'd have quotation marks around Mending Wall. In addition, we do need to add a period at the end of the whole sentence because, after all, sentences need to end with some kind of punctuation mark, and a period would make sense. And the period would go inside the final closing quotation marks, because that's what we do with periods. So the sentence would ultimately be correctly punctuated like this. As Robert Frost remarked in his poem, opening quotation marks, Mending Wall, comma, closing quotation marks, opening quotation marks, good fences make good neighbors, period, closing quotation marks. Let's look at our next example. What did Emerson mean when he wrote the words, I hate quotations, tell me what you know? Ralph Waldo Emerson was a famous 19th century writer, and it's ironic that one of the most famous quotations from his work is this statement about hating quotations, but that's the way it is. Now we have to figure out how we're going to punctuate this sentence, and doing so will prove to be a little bit tricky. First, let's figure out where the quotation is. That is, what are the words that Emerson actually said, which should be enclosed in quotation marks? Well, Emerson's words were, I hate quotations, tell me what you know. So we want to put quotation marks around those sentences. So we will have opening quotation marks in front of I and closing quotation marks after the word know. Now, what about the closing punctuation for the entire sentence? What kind of sentence is this? Well, if you think about it, you can see that the sentence is an interrogative sentence. It's asking a question. What did Emerson mean when he wrote the words blah, blah, blah? What did he mean? It's asking a question. So we need to end the entire sentence with a question mark. So then we have to figure out, where does the question mark go in relation to the quotation marks? Does it go inside the quotation marks or outside them? Well, if we were dealing with a period or a comma, we would always put it inside the quotation marks. But remember, other punctuation marks go either inside or outside the quotation marks, depending on whether they are part of the quotation itself. Now, did Emerson's quotation contain a question mark? Was Emerson asking a question? I hate quotations, tell me what you know. No, that's a declarative sentence. He is not asking a question. So the question mark is not part of Emerson's quotation. Instead, it's part of the broader sentence. The author of this entire sentence is asking the question. So the question mark should go outside of the closing quotation marks, and the sentence would